stand at the edge of the Sahara in modern Sudan, where wind-sculpted dunes meet the life-giving waters of the Nile. And you'll encounter something remarkable. Rising from the desert sands stand over 200 pyramids, steep-sided monuments, to a civilization that once made Egypt itself tremble. These aren't Egyptian pyramids, though their builders knew Egypt intimately. They belong to Kush, an African empire that conquered Egypt, ruled as pharaohs, defied Rome's legions, and pioneered iron production on a scale that earned one of its cities the nickname Birmingham of ancient Africa. For nearly 3,000 years, the Kingdom of Kush shaped the destiny of the Nile Valley. Yet today, it remains overshadowed by its northern neighbor, relegated to footnotes in history books that should devote entire chapters to its story. The tale of Kush is not merely one of rise and inevitable decline. It's a narrative about adaptation and innovation, about how a civilization absorbed influences from its powerful neighbor while maintaining a distinct identity, about warrior queens who held their own against Rome when Rome was at its zenith, and about the environmental consequences of industrial ambition pursued without restraint. To understand Kush is to glimpse a world where African kings restored Egyptian temples, where women ruled empires independently, and where the boundaries between civilization and savagery were drawn very differently than conventional history suggests. This is the story of how Kush emerged from Egypt's shadow to become a power in its own right, conquered the very nation that once subjugated it, survived the collapse that consumed other ancient kingdoms, and ultimately fell not to foreign invaders alone, but to the accumulating weight of its own success. Let's journey south along the Nile, beyond the cataracts, where the river becomes unnavigable, into a land the Egyptians called Taseti, and we now recognize as one of Africa's greatest forgotten civilizations. The region that birthed Kush lies in what geographers call Nubia, a stretch of the Nile Valley extending from Egypt's southern frontier near modern Aswan down to the confluence of the Blue and White Niles at Khartoum. This was never easy country. 6 cataracts, great rapids where granite bedrock forces the Nile into churning fury, break the river into distinct segments, creating natural barriers that isolated communities and kingdoms. Between these cataracts, narrow fertile strips bordered the river, while beyond them stretched the unforgiving Nubian desert. Yet this harsh landscape concealed extraordinary wealth. Gold deposits in the eastern desert and mountains made Nubia the ancient world's primary source of the precious metal. The Egyptian word for gold, nub, may have given Nubia its name, though another theory traces it to the Noba people who settled there in later centuries. Iron ore lay ready for exploitation. Exotic goods from deeper Africa, ivory and ebony and incense, funneled through Nubian trade routes toward Mediterranean markets. And the Nubians themselves proved valuable as soldiers and laborers, so skilled with the bow that Egyptians knew their southern neighbors as the people of Taseti, land of the bow. The earliest complex society here was Kerma, which flourished between 2450 and 1450 BCE. Kerma controlled territory stretching from the first to fourth cataracts, an expanse comparable to Egypt itself. Its people built massive mud brick structures called defufas, developed distinctive red and black pottery, and maintained elaborate burial customs involving hundreds of human sacrifices. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated bronze working tradition and long-distance trade connections. Kerma was not some primitive tribal confederation, but a genuine state with centralized authority, specialized craftspeople, and monumental architecture. Then came Egypt's New Kingdom, expansion around 1550 BCE. Egyptian armies marched south, dismantling Kerma's power structure and incorporating his territories into the Pharaonic Empire. For 5 centuries, Nubia became essentially an Egyptian colony. The conquered land was divided into 2 administrative regions, Wawat in the north and Kush in the south. Egyptian viceroys governed from newly built towns. Temples rose to Egyptian gods. Young Nubians entered Egyptian military service or worked Egyptian estates. Many adopted Egyptian language, religion, and customs, becoming what modern scholars call Egyptianized Nubians, people who looked southward toward their African roots, yet spoke and worshipped like northerners. This period of Egyptian domination left permanent marks on Nubian culture. But it would be wrong to imagine the indigenous traditions simply evaporated. Beneath the veneer of Egyptian language and religion, older customs persisted. The people remembered their distinct ethnic identity. When Egypt weakened during the Bronze Age collapse that shattered civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, the Kushites were positioned to reclaim their independence and forge something new, a synthesis of acquired Egyptian sophistication and native African traditions. Around 1070 BCE, as Egypt's New Kingdom crumbled into the chaos historians call the Third Intermediate Period, Kushite leaders at Napata, near the Fourth Cataract, reasserted their autonomy. This wasn't a violent revolution, but a gradual slipping away as Egyptian authority dissolved. The former colony became an independent kingdom with Napata as its capital, and in the centuries that followed, Kush transformed from Egypt's subordinate into its peer, and eventually its master. The Kushite kings of Napata faced a fascinating challenge. They had been steeped in Egyptian culture for generations. Their priests worshipped Amun, the great Egyptian deity whose cult center at Jebel Barkal, near Napata, featured a striking rock formation that resembled a uraeus, the sacred cobra of Egyptian kingship. They used Egyptian hieroglyphs for writing. They admired Egyptian art and architecture, yet they were also distinctly Kushite, with their own language, their own ethnic identity, their own traditions, including forms of kingship unknown in Egypt. Rather than rejecting one identity for the other, they synthesized both. Kushite kings adopted Egyptian royal titulary and built pyramids as tombs, yet these pyramids were steeper and smaller than their Egyptian counterparts, reflecting Kushite aesthetic preferences. They venerated Amun, but also maintained indigenous African deities. They employed Egyptian artistic conventions while portraying themselves with unmistakably Nubian facial features and regalia, including a distinctive cap crown surmounted by 2 urae instead of the single cobra worn by Egyptian pharaohs. Military strength underpinned Kushite independence. Their archers remained legendary. Ancient sources describe Kushite bowmen using powerful one-piece bows up to 7 feet long, so strong that archers braced them with their feet to bend them for stringing. Arrows tipped with poison made even minor wounds potentially fatal. When Greek historian Herodotus later wrote about the long-lived Ethiopians, He noted their exceptional height and beauty, and described how Persian King Cambyses' attempted invasion of their land ended in disaster when his army starved in the desert. By the 8th century BCE, Kush had become a formidable regional power. As Egypt continued fragmenting, with rival dynasties controlling different parts of the country, and priests of Amun effectively ruling Upper Egypt as a theocratic state, Kushite kings began looking northward with ambition. They saw themselves as the true inheritors of Egypt's new kingdom glory, the legitimate champions of Amun's worship. When they moved into Egypt, they came not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of a sacred order that Egyptians themselves had allowed to decay. The Kushite conquest of Egypt unfolded gradually and began, remarkably, without bloodshed. Around 760 BCE, King Kashta peacefully assumed the title of pharaoh in Thebes, Upper Egypt's religious center. How he accomplished this remains debated. Perhaps local Egyptian elites, disgusted with the weak northern dynasties, invited him. Perhaps Thebes' powerful priesthood of Amun recognized him as Amun's chosen instrument. Regardless, Kashta installed his daughter Amenertis as divine adoratrice of Amun, a position of immense political and spiritual power, effectively making her ruler of Thebes, while her father wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Kashta's successor, Piye, who reigned from approximately 747 to 716 BCE, proved more militarily aggressive. When Prince Tefnakht of Sais in the Nile Delta assembled a coalition of northern rulers and began pushing south, threatening to reunify Egypt under northern control, Piye launched a massive campaign documented on his Victory Stela, one of ancient history's most detailed military accounts. Reading this stela, which Piye erected at the Temple of Amun in Jebel Barkal, provides intimate insight into Kushite values and royal personality. Piye appears as a pious warrior, concerned as much with proper religious observance as with military victory. When his forces captured Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, the stela records his fury upon discovering that the horses of the defeated Egyptian princes had suffered from hunger during the siege. He demanded to see the royal stables before accepting the ruler's submission, because for Piye, who adored horses in the Kushite tradition, mistreatment of these noble animals revealed moral unworthiness. The stela also shows Piye's devotion to Egyptian religious traditions. At each conquered city, he purified himself, entered the temple, and made offering to the local gods before accepting submission. He claimed victory not through his own strength, but through Amun's divine favor. After crushing the northern coalition and receiving submission from Egypt's various princes and petty kings, Piye loaded his ships with treasure and sailed back to Napata, leaving Egypt nominally unified under his rule, but not fundamentally reorganized. Piye's brother Shabaka, who succeeded him around 716 BCE, took a different approach. When Egyptian rulers in the Delta rebelled again, Shabaka personally marched north, defeated them decisively, and established firm Kushite control throughout Egypt. He moved the royal residence to Memphis and set about the systematic work of actually governing the newly reunified country. Under Shabaka and his successors, particularly his nephew Taharka, the 25th dynasty reached its zenith, and Egypt experienced what scholars now call a cultural renaissance. The reign of Taharka, from 690 to 664 BCE, represents ancient Africa's high water mark of power and prosperity. Ascending the throne at 32 after leading armies as a prince, Taharqa proved himself an exceptional ruler. He launched the most ambitious building program Egypt had seen in centuries. At Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes, he added a massive colonnade whose towering columns still impress visitors. He restored temples throughout Egypt and built new ones in Nubia, including a magnificent structure at Jebel Barkal. He constructed his pyramid tomb at Nuri, which became the largest pyramid ever built in Nubia. Under Taharqa, arts and scholarship flourished. Artisans studied masterworks from Egypt's old and middle kingdoms, producing works so faithful to those earlier styles that modern experts sometimes struggle to distinguish 25th dynasty pieces from their ancient models. Religious texts from earlier periods were copied and preserved. The Kushite pharaohs presented themselves as guardians and restorers of authentic Egyptian tradition, more faithful to Egypt's glorious past than the native Egyptian dynasties that preceded them. But Taharqa's reign also brought disaster. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, militaristic masters of Mesopotamia, with superior iron weapons and devastating siege tactics, set their sights on Egypt. Taharqa had unwisely involved himself in Levantine politics, supporting local kingdoms including Judah against Assyrian expansion. The biblical Book of Kings mentions Tirhakah, king of Kush, marching to help besieged Jerusalem, an event that occurred around 701 BCE, when the young Taharqa commanded armies for his predecessor. The Assyrians came in waves. In 674 BCE, Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt, but was initially repulsed, a victory that must have seemed to vindicate Kushite power. 3 years later, in 671 BCE, Esarhaddon returned with overwhelming force. His army swept through the Nile Delta, captured Memphis, and seized members of Taharqa's family, including his heir. Taharqa himself fled south to Thebes, watching his empire crumble. Twice Taharqa attempted to reclaim lost territory, and twice Assyrian forces drove him back. In 664 BCE, the new Assyrian king Ashurbanipal pursued Taharqa's successor, Tantamani, all the way to Thebes, and subjected that sacred city to a catastrophic sack. The destruction of Thebes sent shock waves across the ancient world. The Hebrew prophet Nahum would later invoke its fall as the ultimate example of a mighty city brought low. For Kush, it marked the definitive end of their Egyptian empire. The 25th dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for roughly 80 years, retreated south to Nubia, and Assyria installed an Egyptian puppet dynasty to govern in their stead. The loss of Egypt might have spelled Kush's doom. Instead, it sparked transformation, relocating their capital south from Napata to Meroë around 591 BCE, following an Egyptian raid on Napata by Pharaoh Psamtik II. The Kushites entered what archaeologists call the Meroitic period, and it would prove to be their longest and, in some ways, most remarkable era. Meroe's location offered multiple advantages that Napata lacked. It sat between the 5th and 6th cataracts, far enough south that Egypt could never easily threaten it. Unlike Napata, which depended entirely on Nile floods for agriculture, Meroë enjoyed summer rainfall from the monsoon belt, supporting both farming and grazing. Forests of acacia and other hardwoods grew nearby, crucial for what would become Meroë's signature industry. And beneath the soil lay rich deposits of iron ore. The Kushites had learned ironworking, probably acquiring the technology from Assyrians or through Mediterranean contacts during their time ruling Egypt. At Meroë, they developed it into an industry of staggering scale. Massive slag heaps, the waste residue from iron smelting, accumulated outside the city, some rising to heights of 6 meters. When British archaeologist Archibald Sayce visited in the early 20th century, he famously declared that Meroë must have been the Birmingham of ancient Africa. The smoke of its iron-smelting furnaces must have been continually going up to heaven. Recent archaeological work has provided more nuanced understanding of Meroitic iron production. Rather than continuous operation, the evidence suggests intensive periods of smelting, interspersed with quieter phases, spanning potentially 1,000 years from the 25th dynasty to the late Meroitic period. The scale varied over time, with periods of decline and resurgence. But at its peak, Meroë produced iron tools, weapons, and trade goods in quantities that supplied a vast region. Iron gave Meroë economic and military advantages. Iron tools improved agricultural productivity. Iron weapons equipped formidable armies. And iron became a valuable trade commodity, exported alongside traditional Kushite products like gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins. Trade routes connected Meroë to the Mediterranean world through Egypt, to the Red Sea ports through desert, caravan trails, and deep into sub-Saharan Africa to the Nile's southern tributaries. Archaeological evidence shows Meroitic goods reaching as far as India and Southeast Asia. The city itself became a marvel. Palaces decorated with elaborate frescoes housed the royal family. Temples to both Egyptian deities like Amun, Isis, and Osiris, and distinctly Kushite gods like the lion-headed war god Apidamach dotted the urban landscape. Public baths demonstrated engineering sophistication. And surrounding Meroë in 3 cemetery sites rose the pyramids, steep-sided stone monuments that became the most recognizable legacy of Meroitic civilization. Unlike Egyptian pyramids with internal chambers, Kushite pyramids were built over burial chambers excavated into the rock beneath them, typically featuring an offering chapel on the pyramid's east side, with walls covered in relief sculptures and hieroglyphic or Meroitic inscriptions. The Meroitic script itself deserves attention. As one of ancient Africa's indigenous writing systems. Developing around 300 BCE, it derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but evolved into a distinct alphabetic system with 2 forms, hieroglyphic for monumental inscriptions and cursive for everyday use. Sadly, while scholars have identified phonetic values for many Meroitic signs, allowing them to transliterate texts, the underlying language remains largely undeciphered. Meroitic inscriptions preserve royal names, titles, and some general content, but detailed historical narratives remain locked away, frustrating historians who know that answers to crucial questions about Meroitic society lie in texts they can see but cannot fully read. Cultural synthesis intensified during the Meroitic period. Egyptian influences remained strong in art, architecture, and religion, but indigenous African elements grew more prominent. Meroitic queens wore distinctive jewelry. The god Apidamach, unknown in Egypt, received major temples. Burial customs blended Egyptian and local practices. And most strikingly, women assumed political power in ways unprecedented in the ancient Mediterranean world. In the last decades before the Common Era, something remarkable happened in Meroe. Female rulers, bearing the Meroitic title Kandake, often Latinized as Candace, began ascending to sole power as monarchs in their own right. This wasn't queen regents holding thrones temporarily for young sons, though scholars initially interpreted it that way, unable to conceive that ancient African women might rule independently. These were full-fledged queens, regnant, using the royal title Kor, just as male rulers did, depicted in monumental art, wearing armor and smiting enemies, commanding armies, and conducting diplomacy. The first independently ruling Kandake appears to be Shanaktakete, who reigned around 170 to 150 BCE. Her pyramid at Meroe displays relief sculptures showing her alone, without any king, wearing military regalia and royal insignia. She commissioned major building projects. Inscriptions celebrate her military campaigns. Everything about her tomb proclaims her as a warrior queen who ruled in her own right. But the most famous Kandake was Amanirenas, who reigned approximately from 40 to 10 BCE, and wrote her name into history by accomplishing what few ancient rulers managed. She fought Rome to a standstill and secured favorable peace terms from Augustus Caesar himself. The Meroitic Roman War erupted in 25 BCE, shortly after Rome annexed Egypt, following the deaths of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Rome's presence threatened Kushite interests in Lower Nubia, that territory between Egypt and Kush that had changed hands repeatedly over centuries. When Roman prefect Cornelius Gallus attempted to impose taxes on Kushite-controlled areas, Amanirenas struck first. Her forces, reportedly 30,000 strong, attacked the border cities of Aswan, Philae, and Elephantine. They looted extensively, toppled statues of Augustus, and carried a bronze head of the emperor back to Meroe, where it was buried beneath the threshold of a temple dedicated to victory, ensuring that anyone entering would walk over the Roman emperor's face. The Roman response under Prefect Gaius Petronius was brutal and effective. His 10,000 legionaries drove the Kushite forces back, invaded Meroe's northern territories, captured thousands of prisoners who were sold into slavery, and sacked the religious center of Napata. But when Petronius attempted to hold the conquered territory, Amanirenas demonstrated strategic brilliance. She besieged the Roman garrison at Qasr Ibrim, harassed supply lines, and made occupation costly. Greek geographer Strabo, writing shortly after these events, describes Amanirenas as a masculine sort of woman, blind in one eye, suggesting she lost an eye in combat, a mark of her personal involvement in warfare that matched Kushite royal ideals of kings leading from the front. Whether Strabo met her or relied on second-hand accounts is unclear, but his description captures how Romans perceived her as a formidable adversary who violated their assumptions about both women and Africans. For 3 years, the war continued, and Rome, simultaneously managing conflicts across its vast empire and facing threats far more dangerous to its existence than one Nubian kingdom, eventually decided negotiation beat endless campaigning in hostile desert terrain. Amanirenas' envoys traveled to Samos in 21 BCE, where they met Augustus himself. The resulting treaty stunned Roman observers. Rather than imposing tribute, demanding hostages, or annexing territory as Rome typically did with defeated enemies, Augustus agreed to withdraw Roman forces from the disputed territories and exempted Meroë from paying tribute. The Romans retained only a militarized buffer zone, and even that was partially evacuated in Kush's favor. For the next 3 centuries, until the kingdom's final decline, this treaty held. Meroe remained independent and unmolested by Rome, when almost every other kingdom that bordered the empire had been conquered or reduced to vassal status. Amanirena's success established a precedent. After her death around 10 BCE, power passed to another woman, probably her daughter, Amenishiketo, who reigned until about 1 CE and may have been one of history's wealthiest female rulers, based on the treasures found in her pyramid, before looters destroyed most of them in the 19th century. Queen Amenitore, ruling in the 1st century CE, partnered with King Natakamani in extensive building projects, though inscriptions and art often depict her alone or as the dominant figure. During Meroe's golden age from roughly 50 BCE to 100 CE, women held power more often than men. Of 13 monarchs in this period, 7 were female, and at least 6 ruled independently without co-regents. This pattern of female sovereignty has puzzled scholars. Some theories emphasize matrilineal succession, where kingship passed through the female line, giving royal women structural power. Others point to the religious significance of Kandakes as high priestesses of Amun, making them divinely sanctioned rulers. The full explanation likely combines multiple factors, including specific historical circumstances, cultural attitudes toward gender and leadership that differed from Mediterranean norms, and the individual capabilities of exceptional women who seized power and wielded it effectively. What cannot be disputed is that these queens ruled successfully. They commanded armies, conducted diplomacy, commissioned monumental architecture, and presided over Meroe during its most prosperous era. They offer a counter-narrative to assumptions about women's roles in ancient societies, proof that under different cultural conditions, female leadership flourished, even in militaristic states. But no golden age lasts forever, and Meroe's contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very industry that brought wealth, that iron production celebrated by later archaeologists, required fuel. Smelting iron demands enormous quantities of charcoal. Producing charcoal requires wood, and supplying Meroe's furnaces over centuries gradually stripped the surrounding landscape of forests. Environmental degradation accelerated during Meroe's peak prosperity. As trees disappeared, soil lost its anchor, erosion increased. Agricultural land became less productive. The cattle that grazed around Meroe, important both for sustenance and as markers of wealth and status in Kushite culture, overgrazed remaining vegetation. Fields that had sustained intensive agriculture became exhausted. The ecological balance tipped toward collapse. Climate played a role too. Evidence suggests that the monsoon belt, which brought summer rainfall to Meroe's region, shifted southward during the first few centuries CE, reducing precipitation exactly when environmental stress from human activity peaked. Desertification advanced. The fertile grasslands that made Meroe prosper began transforming into the barren landscape travelers encounter today. Economic pressures compounded environmental decline. Trade patterns changed as Rome developed alternative routes. The Red Sea trade that had enriched Meroe faced competition from the Kingdom of Axum, a rising power in the Ethiopian highlands with better access to ports and closer connections to Arabia and India. As Axum's commercial networks expanded, Meroe's economic importance diminished. Reduced trade meant reduced revenue for the kingdom's elite. weakening their ability to maintain centralized authority. By the 3rd century CE, signs of decline multiplied. The pyramids built for later Meroitic rulers grew smaller and less elaborate, suggesting reduced resources or power. Non-royal burials became more elaborate, indicating that local elites were accumulating wealth and prestige that once concentrated in the monarchy. Inscriptions grew scarce. Urban sites showed abandonment or transformation into smaller settlements. The centralized Meroitic state appeared to be fragmenting into regional polities, ruled by increasingly autonomous local leaders. Around 350 CE came the final blow. King Ezana of Axum, emboldened by his kingdom's rising power and perhaps provoked by Kushite raids or commercial disputes, invaded Meroe. Axumite inscriptions, written in 3 languages on stone monuments Ezana erected, describe the campaign in vivid language. The king's forces burned Meroitic towns, captured prisoners, seized livestock, and imposed tribute. Whether Axum completely destroyed Meroe or merely delivered the final blow to an already collapsing state remains debated. The archaeological record shows Meroe abandoned during the 4th century, with the last pyramids and inscriptions dating to this period. In Meroe's wake came a period archaeologists call post-Meroitic, marked by declining urbanism, the disappearance of Meroitic script and religion, and the emergence of regional cultures. New kingdoms arose in Nubia, including Napata, Mercuria, and Alodia, which would eventually convert to Christianity in the 6th century and reshape Nubian identity completely. But the kingdom that built over 200 pyramids, that ruled Egypt as pharaohs, that pioneered iron production in Africa, and fielded warrior queens who fought Rome to a standstill, had reached its end after nearly 3 millennia of existence. For centuries after Kush's fall, its monuments stood silent in the desert, noted by occasional travelers but largely forgotten by the wider world. European explorers and archaeologists focused their attention on Egypt. When they did investigate sites in Sudan, racial prejudices initially prevented them from crediting black African peoples with creating sophisticated civilizations. Early 20th century scholars sometimes attributed Meroitic achievements to light-skinned immigrants or Egyptian colonists rather than indigenous Nubians, reflecting biases that couldn't conceive of sub-Saharan Africans as empire builders. This began changing during the late 20th century as archaeological work intensified. UNESCO designated the pyramids of Meroe a World Heritage Site. Excavations revealed the extent of Meroitic urban planning, craft production, and trade networks. Analysis of skeletal remains and artistic depictions confirmed that Kush's rulers were indeed Black Africans, making the 25th dynasty's rule of Egypt one of history's most significant examples of African power. The script remains partially undeciphered, though scholars have made progress identifying phonetic values and some word meanings. Breaking the Meroitic code completely would revolutionize understanding of Kushite history, potentially revealing detailed political narratives, religious texts, and historical records, now frustratingly opaque. Until that happens, historians must reconstruct Kush's story from archaeological evidence, Egyptian and classical sources, and the limited material their partial understanding of Meroitic texts provides. Modern Sudan takes pride in its Kushite heritage. The pyramids appear on currency and official emblems, Archaeological sites attract both researchers and tourists, though political instability has sometimes hindered excavation and preservation work. International interest has grown, with scholars recognizing Kush as crucial to understanding ancient African history beyond Egypt. Why was Kush forgotten for so long? Multiple factors converged. Egypt's dramatic monuments and decipherable hieroglyphs made it accessible to early archaeologists. Kush's remote location in Sudan, a region that faced colonial exploitation and later civil conflict, limited investigation. The undeciphered Meroitic script prevented easy access to written records, and racial biases made scholars reluctant to credit Black Africans with achievements like conquering Egypt or defying Rome. But Kush's significance cannot be overstated. It demonstrated that sophisticated civilizations arose independently in sub-Saharan Africa. It showed cultural synthesis working both ways, with Africans adopting Egyptian elements while maintaining distinct identity, and Egyptians during the 25th dynasty absorbing Kushite influences. It pioneered iron production that may have spread throughout Africa. Its warrior queens challenged assumptions about gender and power in the ancient world. And it survived as an independent power for nearly 3,000 years, longer than most empires that dominate history textbooks. Standing before those steep-sided pyramids today, one cannot help pondering what lessons Kush's story offers. The kingdom's rise demonstrates that geography isn't destiny. Despite cataracts fragmenting the Nile and deserts isolating Nubia, Kushites created a prosperous state by exploiting resources, controlling trade routes, and developing military prowess. When Egypt expanded, Kushites absorbed what proved useful while retaining core identity. When Egypt weakened, they seized independence and eventually turned the tables, conquering their former overlords. The 25th dynasty shows how conquerors can revitalize rather than destroy. The Kushite pharaohs didn't impose foreign rule on Egypt, but instead presented themselves as restorers of authentic Egyptian tradition. Their cultural renaissance preserved and revived Egyptian arts and religion at a moment when native dynasties had allowed decline. They ruled as pharaohs, who happened to come from Nubia, rather than as Nubian occupiers of Egypt. Meroe's prosperity and the long peace with Rome after Amanirenas' war highlight the value of strategic wisdom over raw military power. Rome possessed vastly superior resources and armies, but Amanirenas made occupying Kushite territory costly enough that pragmatic Romans chose negotiation. The resulting treaty secured centuries of independence, a diplomatic triumph comparable to any battlefield victory. The environmental catastrophe that contributed to Meroe's fall carries obvious modern resonance. An industrial economy based on unsustainable resource extraction, particularly deforestation, gradually destroyed the ecological foundation supporting that economy. When forests disappeared, multiple systems collapsed simultaneously: soil stability, agricultural productivity, charcoal supply for iron production, and climate regulation. Contemporary societies pursuing economic growth through environmental exploitation might reflect on how Meroe's ironworks fell silent as the trees that fueled them vanished. The warrior queens demonstrate that gender roles vary culturally and historically. Western classical civilizations rarely accepted female rulers, making the Kandake seem exceptional. But within Meroitic culture, female sovereignty became normalized, producing multiple consecutive queens who ruled effectively. This suggests that assumptions about women's capabilities in leadership or warfare reflect cultural conditioning more than biological constraint. Finally, Kush's modern obscurity reminds us that history often remembers empires that left extensive written records in languages scholars can read, that dominated Mediterranean civilization where classical sources concentrated, or that captured European imagination during archaeology's formative era. Kushite achievements matched or exceeded those of other ancient kingdoms now considered essential to world history curricula. Yet because their script remains largely undeciphered, because they operated in Africa beyond Egypt, and because racist assumptions long denied black Africans credit for civilization building, Kush languished in historical shadows. That's changing. Each excavation season reveals more about this remarkable kingdom. Each advance in deciphering Meroitic brings scholars closer to hearing Kushite voices speak directly rather than filtering them through Egyptian and classical accounts. Each generation of scholars examines Kush with fewer preconceptions and a greater recognition of Africa's role in shaping human civilization. The pyramids endure in Sudan's desert, monuments to kings and warrior queens who conquered Egypt, traded with India, pioneered African iron production, and carved out 3,000 years of independent civilization, while most kingdoms rose and fell within centuries. Their story deserves to be told, studied, and remembered alongside Egypt, Greece, and Rome as one of the ancient world's great powers. Kush was no footnote to Egyptian history, but a rival, a conqueror, a trading empire, and ultimately a victim of its own success in the accumulated weight of environmental consequences. The desert wind still blows across those steep pyramids, carrying sand that gradually reclaims the monuments, brick by brick. But the story they tell of African kings who wore the double crown, of queens who defied Rome, of iron smelters whose furnaces glowed like stars in the darkness, of a civilization that synthesized cultures while maintaining its distinct identity. That story survives. And with each archaeological season, with each advance in understanding Meroitic script, with each recognition that African history extends far beyond Egypt's borders, that story grows clearer. Kush reminds us that history contains multitudes of forgotten civilizations waiting for rediscovery, that assumptions about which peoples could build empires and rule effectively often reflect bias more than evidence, and that the rise and fall of kingdoms follows patterns worth studying, whether those kingdoms stood beside the Tiber or along the Nile's southern reaches. The Kingdom of Kush rose from Egypt's shadow, conquered its former master, survived the collapse that ended the Bronze Age world, pioneered industries, fielded warrior queens, and ultimately fell when environmental degradation and external pressures overwhelmed it. That's a story worth remembering. If this journey through Kush's 3 millennia has sparked your interest in ancient Africa's forgotten civilizations, please like this video and subscribe to History Scrolls for more deep dives into the empires, kingdoms, and cultures that shaped our world, but rarely make it into mainstream histories. Share your thoughts in the comments about which aspects of Kushite civilization fascinate you most, or which other overlooked ancient societies you'd like us to explore. Until next time, keep scrolling through history.